Hey everybody, Nick Espinosa, your chief security fanatic here. And today in artificial intelligence news, I actually have to essentially update a video slash podcast slash radio segment I did about a month plus ago on essentially the consumption of power and water now that artificial intelligence is actually consuming. And quite frankly, the US electrical grid as well as our water infrastructure really can't handle the needs of generative AI. And so in that previous video, I discussed this issue and focus on what big tech is essentially trying to innovate to fix this. This time, we're actually going to go through the backdrop of essentially the problem and then discuss the power grid and water as it is right now and those issues, because quite frankly, it may be great to innovate 5, 10, 20 years down the road, but we have shortages now that are getting worse and they're not being fully addressed. Now, here's what's going on. And CNBC was the one that actually really had me thinking about this as I was putting together my notes. And so obviously concerns are mounting about whether the United States can actually generate enough electricity for the widespread adoption of artificial intelligence and whether our deeply aging grid, which we'll talk about, will be able to actually handle this load. Now, one ChatGPT query, if you remember, I used this stat last time, uses nearly 10 times as much energy as a typical Google search. That's according to a report and study by Goldman Sachs. But what I didn't mention last time is that generating an AI image can use as much power as charging your smartphone. That's huge. Now think about how long the battery lasts in your smartphone. If it's an Apple, it's pretty good. If it's an Android, it's not as good, but it's still pretty good. And I'm sure I'm going to get crap for that. But quite frankly, I have Androids and they don't nearly last as long as the iPhones we demo. So with that, charging, or rather generating an AI image can use as much power as charging your cell phone. And so by virtue of that, these hyperscalers that are building these data centers all over the place to accommodate this are also seeing emissions soar. Google's latest environmental report showed that greenhouse gas emissions rose nearly 50% from 2019 through 2023, in part because of data center energy consumption, although it also said that its data centers are 1.8 times as energy efficient as a typical data center. And they may have the money to do that, but quite frankly, a lot of them lease space in other data centers, which we'll talk about as well. Now, Microsoft's emissions rose nearly 30% from 2020 to 2024, also due in part to their expansive data centers. And in Kansas City, where Meta, aka Facebook, is building an AI-focused data center, the power needs in the area are stressing the grids, and the cause of need is so high that the plans that Kansas City had to basically shut down a coal-fired power plant due to emissions problems in and of itself are now being put on hold, because if they shut it down, they're going to not have enough power for businesses, for homes, and for the data centers that Meta has. Now, there are more than 8,000 data centers globally, which I mentioned last time, and the highest concentration of those is in the United States. And thanks to artificial intelligence, there's going to be way more by the end of this decade. Boston Consulting Group also estimated that the demand for data centers will rise 15 to 20% every single year through 2030 as we continue to consume more artificial intelligence, generate more images, take pictures and upload them to Facebook and on and on and on, YouTube videos, you name it. And they're expecting basically that to comprise 16% of total US power consumption. The biggest driver being artificial intelligence, meaning we are essentially absolutely blowing the doors off of our energy use because of this. Now, that is up from just 2.5% before OpenAI's ChatGPT hit the market in 2022. And for the record, it's the equivalent of the power used by about 2 out of 3 homes in the entire United States. That's the level of depth that we are talking about here in terms of consumption. It's absolutely enormous. So, as much as fixing this problem in the future with these new innovative products, let's just store data on the moon, whatever it is, that's great. But we need to discuss what's happening now, because the US's aging power grid is often ill-equipped to handle the load, even where enough power can be generated. Now, this bottleneck, interestingly enough, occurs in getting power from the generation site to where it's actually being consumed. And so, by virtue of that, real, actual, on-the-ground solutions have to be devised. And one of those is to basically add hundreds or thousands of miles of transmission lines. In other words, you see them across if you're driving around, or they're buried sometimes underground, adding way more than what we currently have to handle this load. But that is very costly and that is very time consuming. It doesn't fix it now, but it starts to fix it. And sometimes those costs are passed down to your utility bill. So if you're in Kansas City and Meta's building data centers left and right, and you're basically in part subsidizing that because your electricity bill is going up to subsidize the massive new power generation and creation and construction that the power companies need, that's what we're talking about here. Now, one $5.2 billion effort to expand lines just in Virginia, the state of Virginia, and there's an area known as Data Center Alley, was met with opposition from the local ratepayers because they didn't want to see their bills increase to basically fund that project. Now, another solution is to use predictive software that reduces failures in the weakest points of the grid. Now, these are transformers, and here's one of the biggest issues. The average age of a transformer in the United States in the electrical grid is 38 years old. Some of you listening to this or watching this weren't even born when the transformers may have been put in your area, because that's the average, meaning there are some that are way older and some that are way newer that have been replaced. And so it's a common cause of power outages, and replacing them is very expensive and very slow. And so we don't have essentially a presto changeo, kind of thing. They say, oh, we're more efficient, but great. You might be 1.8 times more efficient than the other data centers, but when you're opening up 20 data centers to the one, you're still consuming more power. So it doesn't help in the long run. It's self-defeating until we actually figure this out. Now, on the other side of this coin is water. This is a huge problem. If you didn't know, the U.S. West, the western part of the U.S., per studies and reports, I literally just read this earlier today, which also got me thinking about this, is the driest it's been in according to in the last 1,200 years in that region. Meaning right now, they have the least amount of water they've had in 1,200 years. Scientists taking core samples, geologists taking core samples, looking at this kind of stuff and seeing essentially just how dry it is. Not to mention, we've got major rivers that have greatly declined. We've seen it in California and other places as well. And we are building basically infrastructure and data centers that require an absolute ton of water. Generative AI data centers require 4.2 billion to 6.6 billion cubic meters of water withdrawal by 2027. That's according to researchers. And that's more than the total annual water withdrawal for half of the entire United Kingdom. So this is a massive, massive amount of water that is needed. Every 10 to 50, 10 to 50 ChatGPT prompts can burn through a 16-ounce bottle of water. That is absolutely enormous. And we have millions and millions and millions of prompts for generative AI every single day. And that rate continues to increase as adoption continues to increase. And much of that water is actually used for evaporative cooling. But fortunately, newer data centers are starting to have large air conditioning units that cool buildings without basically any water withdrawal. But here's the thing. That on top of the direct-to-chip cooling using different types of liquids, while those are great, we now have to retrofit 8,000 plus data centers around the world to basically reduce that water footprint, not to mention the fact we have other uses for water, aside from the fact we actually need it to live. We have massive amounts of cattle, for the beef industry, all this kind of stuff. I'm not saying get rid of that. There's no easy answer here. But the point is you've got something that is consuming water at a faster rate than, cows can have calves, right? And they continue to grow and they continue to demand, but you also have local populations that also need access to that water, and it has to be sustainable. And so by virtue of this, there is no easy answers. And at some point, I'm predicting that the US grid is going to fail, at least in some areas, and it's going to fail hard. Now, we've seen issues with Texas, for example, and most of Texas, for the record, because Texas is Texas, does what they want. And when Texas gets unusually cold weather like snow, which is something Texas usually doesn't get, the grid has frozen. We've seen millions of people stranded a couple of years ago around the entire Austin area. We were seeing videos of people just stranded in their homes, no power, no nothing, because the grids basically froze. And so if you are looking at that and you're looking at that at a wider scale, if we are having simple issues generating and delivering power, and we've got infrastructure that's almost 40 years old on average delivering this is a huge issue. I don't see essentially how we get around this without having some kind of failure and therefore some kind of reckoning. And so by virtue of that, here we are. I'm not a fan of being a Debbie Downer, but quite frankly, this is not something we're really talking about in the way we should be. And so here we are. Let's have the discussion. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP until the power goes out. Same with YouTube. And as always, stay safe, stay online, and please attempt to stay private. Thanks, everybody.